So my name's Charlie, as mentioned. My background is actually architecture, the building kind, not the software kind. And I've worked on quite a few projects, and they kind of vary in typology. So this is the vessel that will be situated in the middle of Hudson Yards, all the way on the west side. Slated to be completed 2019. I've also worked on a series of chairs, and of course skyscrapers. That's kind of some of the stuff that I've worked on the most. All of which were done, using algorithms to either automate or resolve geometry or things to that effect. I also used to teach a class that was called Algorithmic Space, and the images here they'll allude to some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about, kind of my personal interests. So I titled my talk "In Between Pixels." Back in the day, I studied finance for 2 years, and during that time, the only thing that actually interested me in those 2 years was actually English literature. And I like the idea of authors being able to essentially compose an image, compose a frame in your mind, and it allows you, the reader, to read in between the lines based on what they're writing so that you can understand or kind of, they can hint at what they're trying to express. So this concept of in between, the idea of being in between two extremes is something that I kind of feel like where I am in my life. I'm an architect, but I actually write code to a certain degree. My interest is actually still writing code as well for personal reasons, but I also like images. So images usually, tell a story. The famous phrase, image is worth 1,000 words. Probably these days they're worth more. But how can you tell a story in a single image, but it's a story that happens over time? And there's some basic kind of ways you could do it. There's this one website, NewYorkCityGrid.com. I'm just going to switch over to the website real quick, where they have new and old images of New York City, and you can just kind of like scrub across the two, so you can get an idea of what was the past and what is the current or the future, so on and so forth. So things like that kind of interest me, but in a way, it's only interactive if you actually sit there and click on it. You could do, of course, long exposures, right? And this kind of tells you the idea that there's something happening over time. You could do image stacking. This is something I did while I was out in Utah, just being able to take a series of long exposures and stack them on top of one another. And I came across this one artist, Jason Schulman, and he did some pretty interesting work where he basically takes every single frame of a movie and essentially averages it. So regardless where that frame fits in that entire sequence, you just move it around anywhere you go, you're always going to end up with the same result. And you end up with some some interesting kind of images. So this is the movie Dumbo. This is Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And the interesting thing about this is that, clearly it's like a horror movie and all that, but even in the image, there's some pretty abrupt kind of strokes within it. So maybe that's an illusion of violence, where the previous image, it's a lot more subtle, being Dumbo, a kid's movie, being able to kind of express more of what's happening there. There's a phrase in a quote that he says, and this result is essentially the burning image in the retina's eye, so to say, if you just had to leave it ongoing. So another way of telling a story over time is essentially to do a time lapse, right? Just take a series of images and then kind of tween in between them. I'll just fast forward this real quick. So you go from daylight to nightlight, and you can capture the clouds, you can capture people, you can actually capture tidal changes. I've done that as well. So what if you were to take the first frame and the last frame and essentially try to stitch those together, and then take all the intermediate frames and stitch those together as well? Having several hundred images, you can't really do this manually. This is where processing came into play for me, which was a lot of fun. So I essentially took the images and I just found out how many images I had, found out the width of each, took the number of images divided by the width of the image, and then just kind of spliced them all across horizontally. So you get daytime to nighttime from left to right. And it's kind of interesting to see some of the cloud movement, how it goes up and down in the skyline. So while I did it vertically, why not just try it horizontally as well? So I did the same thing. The number of images I had, divide by the height of the image, and just start stitching them across. And you can start to see daytime at the top, and then nighttime at the bottom. You can see the reflection of the building lights in the water, even though they're not on just yet. And then, well, horizontal, vertical, why not just do diagonal as well? So this one's kind of more interesting. Clearly I have a couple of bugs because the lower right-hand corner didn't really finish, and for some reason I had the last frame all the way on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, so we got to kind of adjust that a little bit. And then there's a variable that will control if I want to do every image, every 10th image, every 5th image, so on and so forth. I've come to realize that actually the more images I have, the unclearer the image actually becomes. So that's kind of like a little bit about some of the, taking static photography and trying to do some interesting stuff with it. But I want to be able to see what I can't see in a photo. When I took a drawing class, I remember my professor saying, draw what you see and not what you think you see. You see a person, you see a car, you see a building, so on and so forth, but there's actually a series of gradations of shadows, there's reflections, there's so many different things that actually exist within that image. This is a project that I worked on, and everyone will see, a building or so on, but no one will actually see the relationships that exist within that building. So, for example, this one, there's a series of studies that were happened for, solar analysis. The profile of the building is a series of arcs, which are tangential at some point. There's varying relationships that exist within what we see. So I just took a simple photo out of a window, typical, Greenwich Village skyline. And if you were to take that, dump it into Illustrator, do a live trace on it, you start to get, these kind of blobs of where there's color similarity. And if you just select on it, you can kind of get the profile of those blobs. So what I wanted to do is see if I can do this sort of in real time. So there's this processing library called Blob Detection by Julian. I'm not going to even try to pronounce his surname. But basically, by incorporating this library into processing, I'm able to take live images via webcam and essentially distill them and break them apart. So all the similar colors will get a profile around them. And it kind of is this idea of like burning an image in a way. I did black and white photography for a little bit too, and the same concept of burning and dodging is kind of it gives you the illusion of that is happening, but essentially it's just kind of like being pulled apart. This is just a diagram explaining, from top left what's happening. So this is a photo of, one of my old desks in an old office I used to work at. Takes a color, kind of breaks it down, finds similar color values, and draws a profile around it, and then just here's kind of before and after tweening of the two. The interesting thing about this was one time I had it running during an event in my old office, and it was kind of interesting to see when people are there for quite a while, you can kind of see the creases in their clothes, the highlights, and what kind of interested me was, let me rewind a little bit, was that even though the walls are white, you can still see where the light falls on the wall. So this is kind of telling us what's actually there versus our perception of what's there. So we know it's a white wall, but we can understand better how the light is kind of just coming across and creating various gradations. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And this is where the scary part comes into play. This is where I try to do a live demo while I'm recording as well. So hold your breath. In the meantime, if you have any questions up till this point, feel free to ask away. So what this is doing is essentially going to the webcam and essentially taking that image of what's there and kind of starting to draw it in by profile of the similar color types. So all the different shades of white, all the different shades of green, red, blue, you know, so on and so forth. So it kind of creates some interesting images, which is pretty cool, right? I had this running during one of my Halloween parties several years ago, and kind of between all the costumes and the people, it kind of did some pretty cool stuff as well. And then all of these images get saved as well. Cool. So being an architect, we design buildings, we design spaces, so on and so forth. And you always talk about space and, the experience of the space. Whether you're, for example, in a church versus a courthouse versus your living room versus someone else's living room, space changes and your experience changes quite a bit. So how can you, I ask myself, from a photo, how can you experience space? This is Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. It's designed by Antonio Gaudí, and it's still, being finished today. He never got to see it completed. It's a pretty amazing piece of architecture. I highly recommend you check it out. But if you have a simple image like this, how can you actually experience the space within it? My desk clearly is not exciting, but I'm going to explain a little bit of how I try to experiment creating space from just a 2D image. So camera is just looking at a certain view. You identify the pixels within that view, and then you start to pull them apart based on their color value. You flip it sideways, and you actually try to inhabit within it. So this is just kind of one of the examples of taking something that was boring and mundane and actually created something that I thought was kind of cool, kind of interesting. I'm going to try to demo this one as well. This one has some pretty crude keyboard controls to be able to move around. This is kind of done in the day before, there was kind of more interactive controls and so on and so forth. So if I just kind of click through, I can slowly start to kind of maneuver around. I can also change the kind of the ratio that I've given it in terms of the space of going, oops, wrong button. Here we go. So I can kind of change its frequency and actually kind of start to now venture within it and try to see if there's kind of any interesting forms or anything spaces that can come about it. I kind of gave this exercise to my students at one point to try to recreate. So nothing, too spectacular, nothing groundbreaking, but again, just trying to get inside of something in a way. Coincidentally, there's a building in Barcelona called Tower of Akbar, and on the facade, they actually use this kind of pixelated gradation from red to blue, which I thought was pretty thoughtful in a way. The interesting thing with that, the previous project, is that as you start to pull these colors apart, clearly the similar colors are going to be in similar gradations, right? So the lighter colors are going to be in one area, the darker colors are going to be in another area, medium tones are going to be in another area. But what if the colors can actually find each other in space? So that was something I was kind of thinking about, just as animals will flock together, can colors flock together as well? So if you just take, for example, it's a mural in San Francisco. What if all the reds would try to find each other, and the greens would find each other, and the blues, and all the grays, and so on and so forth? And as they're constantly moving one frame at a time, kind of their center point, their kind of focal point starts to move with them. And I thought it would, yield something along this line. But in reality, it yielded something wildly different, something I never expected, which I thought was still pretty cool nonetheless. And this project, basically there's 4 categories that the colors are looking for. The pixels that are more blue, the pixels that are more red, the pixels that are more green, or the pixels that are more of a shade of gray. And the shade of gray, I define those by being RGB, being all the same value, where in the other 3 categories, the R, the G, or the B is greater than the others. And that's how they start to congregate. So when the image is first taken, all the blues are categorized, all the reds and greens and so on. And then their average is figured out to find that kind of like focal point. And then they start to, with every frame, they start to move in that direction. And as they move, that focal point kind of traverses a little bit. But then it kind of hits this equilibrium where they just start to kind of hover in around each other. So I'm just going to run through this video. So this was totally accidental as well. Somewhere I kind of messed around with the vector math, and they were actually kind of bypassing each other in a way, because I think what I did was I set a minimum threshold of their vector, so they actually overshoot that center point and allows them to come back, which I thought was pretty interesting. And that's kind of where I stopped the project, because I actually landed in something that I thought was more interesting than what I really wanted to do. So clearly there's also, this fascination of color that I've been kind of experimenting with, and the idea that color is this sensation towards the eye, and it kind of evokes certain feelings internally. There's this one artist called Natural Palettes at tumblr.com, and I'm just going to go to their website real quick because I didn't get permission to use their photos, so that's why I didn't put them in the presentation. But if I go to their site, I think that's kosher, right? So they do some interesting stuff where they essentially take an image and they kind of break it down based on color similarities, or kind of like the most used colors within an image. And I thought this was really beautiful. Partially, the images that the artist was using, but also, let me see if I can zoom in for you guys. There you go. Partially again, the images that the artist was using, but also the tones that started to come out of these images. I thought they were, pretty peaceful, and there's a level of harmony that's happening there, which is quite nice. So I wanted to explore a similar idea and see if I can kind of do that using algorithms. So I just took, a photo of a rose, and basically what this does, so the circles at the bottom look at each kind of like vertical swatch of the image, and they start to find the more similar or the most used color in that vertical swatch. And then the circles on the right-hand side look horizontally, and they try to find the most used color in that horizontal swatch. In doing this exercise, and this image and the next image are kind of more obvious ones, but in doing this exercise, it took me a little while to validate this, because on certain images, it actually gives you results which you don't expect. And I was trying to understand why this was happening. And really what it was is that the color that you perceive to be the most used actually is not. A lot of times brighter colors, so an image could be pretty dark, and there's a handful of portions of the image that are brighter than the darker image, and you're going to get this perception that that brighter color is actually more frequent within this certain swatch of the image, but is actually kind of deceiving, because the brighter color gives you a different perception than the darker color, and vice versa. So that was something that I'm still kind of experimenting with, to be able to fine-tune it so that this is kind of like one iteration of it, but also to fine-tune the algorithm so that you get what you think you should be getting in a way. So you're almost kind of lying to yourself to validate yourself in a way. So that being said, that's kind of in between pixels.
My question, I'm sorry, my question for you would be, like, since you learn a lot of things about the color pattern, the sequence perception, right? And I know that as an architect, probably you're very into with color and detail things. So what has like what changed that for you?
Yeah, good question. I probably don't have an answer to that, unfortunately, because I worked, while I was an architect, I worked a lot on skyscrapers. And the color tone on skyscrapers doesn't vary too much, ironically. Their form, their image in terms of their being a piece of icon in the skyline, the color of glass is important, the reflectivity of the glass, the solar heat gain, like all the analytics behind that is important. If I worked on smaller scale architecture, I think that would come into play, or if I did interior architecture, I think that would be kind of more relevant in my life. And maybe this is kind of like making up for that fact that I don't use too much color. But, yeah.
Just a question about the last image you showed, because it showed this unexpected result. Just wonder, like detail, how do you compare the colors? Like pixel different, like, or do you have to smooth the colors? Like similar and
Yeah, there is a certain level of smoothing that does happen here. The reason being is that sometimes you'll end up with like the top 5 colors all being like one value apart, and you can't really discern like are they actually different or the same or so on. So there is a threshold that I put in there to make it a little more diverse or a little more obvious. I can't remember what that value is, unfortunately. Yeah. Thank you.